wanted to start by just talking about baby bonds. So the subject of Bloomberg Business Week's cover story, which I wrote, is this concept of baby bonds that you came up with more than a decade ago. Let's start by just saying, explain to us what is a baby bond and what is it designed to do?
And I'm going to start with gratitude. If you have not read that article yet, the article is a parallel of my life with a policy proposal that was developed and is now being thought about in state houses across the country, as well as at the federal level. But Ben, his ability to capture the essence of me is personally gratifying, I think extraordinary, and my family, who, they didn't choose to have a public persona, they were so proud of it. So it's personally meaningful for me, and I really want to start with gratitude before we begin this talk. So baby bonds, what are baby bonds? Baby bonds are a birthright to capital. It is saying that simply by being born, there will be a set-aside amount of resource reserved for you that when you become a young adult, you can have access to an endowment to begin a lifetime of building wealth, building the economic security associated with wealth. So really they're trust accounts. And the concept is a right to a trust account where it wouldn't be reserved only for the wealthy, but for everyone.
Except the poor kids would get more money. And why don't you tell the story of how you came up with this idea, and that we can walk into how they're designed.
Again, as the article describes, I had, as some people might say in a cliche form, a tale of two cities. I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I went to an elite private school downtown Brooklyn, Brooklyn Friends School. And I was able to attend that school because of sacrifice and my parents basically being in over their head. But what we talk about in the story also is that this is not a story about triumph, because I lost my parents. I lost my parents in my teen years for what I think is the result of stress. But nonetheless, they exposed me to that education. So I could play football with my neighbors who I grew up with, and then I can go to Brooklyn Friends and play basketball with the children of elite people, and I could see that in essence they were not different. But yet if we watch their trajectories, one might end up literally robbing an armored car, and the other could end up literally an investment banker. And the difference between those two pathways was capital. The difference between those two pathways were resources that their parents had. So what this is proposing is, again, a set-aside amount of resources so that that child who grows up, regardless of whether they're black, white, Bedford-Stuyvesant, or Brooklyn Heights, can still have a pathway towards economic security.
And when you came, this is really building on decades of work that you and others have done on really talking about wealth and talking about the racial wealth gap. So why are baby bonds a way to tackle the racial wealth gap?
I like to describe them as, from a policy standpoint, race neutral, but in practice, they are anti-racist. And what makes them anti-racist? We're, at this point, pretty much all familiar with the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is dramatic, such that the typical black family generally has about a dime for every dollar held by the typical white family. And we're not even talking about mean. If we look at the mean, then the difference is far more dramatic. If we look at the mean, the typical white family has, the average white family has close to $1 million in wealth. But we know that's not typical for most white families. So looking at the mean, looking at differences between the experience of what happens typically across families, white people have less wealth far more wealth than black people. And the result is not because of some effort or some educational disparity, but rather it's rooted in history. We know that a white asset-based middle class never simply emerged. It was federal policy. It was the GI Bill. It was the Homestead Act. And we know that when those bills were enacted, although they may have seemed facially race neutral, they didn't explicitly say that black people could not be part of the homesteaders or black people couldn't get a GI Bill, but they were administered in a racial way. They were designed in a racial way. For example, Social Security. Social Security in its original form excluded domestic and agricultural workers. And what happened in 1930? The typical, a black woman who was employed, 90% of them were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker. For black men, it was over half. So that was clearly a racist design. So what baby bonds can do is, they're not reparations. They're not substitutes for reparations, let's be clear. But what they can do is, going forward, they can ensure that everybody has access to some capital to redress some of the historical disparities that have emerged. They almost become an automatic stabilizer. So an automatic stabilizer for your family who might be, you could imagine being born into a family where you could have been your parents could have been a doctor, and then they get sued for malpractice. Their child still would need some access to wealth, even though at one point they might have been wealthy and now they're wealth poor. So in that sense, baby bonds become an automatic stabilizer that is counterintuitive for U.S. policy. Usually we associate social mobility with one's family. This is saying that as a child, irrespective of your gender, your race, or the family position in which you're born, you will have some set aside for you as a right so that you can reap the rewards of whatever ingenuity you have or whatever effort you might want to bestow.
So in your original proposal, you were thinking about $50,000 to $60,000 that the poorest kids would be able to access when they hit 18 or early adulthood. This is an idea that's gaining real momentum, and it's happening on the state level. And the states can't afford $50,000 to $60,000 per kid. But what they're doing is both DC and Connecticut have already implemented these things. I'm getting some of the information out of the way. And they're basically starting with about $3,000 and then investing it and hoping it'll be more like $10,000 or more by the time these kids get to be 18. They're only focusing on the Medicaid-eligible kids. So it's about half of babies born in Connecticut and DC are Medicaid-eligible. So it's a good number of children. And then we have real momentum in Washington State, Massachusetts. We have proposals. The governor of New Jersey has proposed this. We have legislators in New York. Mostly blue states are really getting serious about this, and they have they're doing pretty well financially right now, just because of stimulus money and other things. So this is one place they're putting the money. Tell me how you feel about the political situation around baby bonds right now and the momentum it's getting. Are these state programs enough?
The state programs are a giant leap forward. We don't need to wait for the federal government. We can start demonstrations at a local level. We can build up momentum, political momentum, at a local level with the goal, the North Star is the federal government. The federal government is the entity that has the capacity to ensure that every child has a birthright to capital. As you mentioned, Ben, the biggest obstacle, particularly on the state level, is finance. The capacity to seed that money, especially when they're dealing with more emergency situations on a regular basis. But the federal government does have the finance capacity. Let me also say something about the universality of it. What is elegant about the program is its stakeholder society aspect. Again, whether you're born into the most wealth family or the lowest wealth family, you get a stake in our society. So they're just like Social Security. That makes that program elegant. But what you also need, in addition to the universal aspect of everybody being eligible, it has to be progressively seeded. If it's not progressively seeded, then it's inflationary. If you literally gave everybody the same amount at birth, then what you're doing is enhancing inequality. Those that have more will be able to add to their wealth portfolio in a compounded way. Also, if you literally gave everybody the same amount, you raise the price level for assets in a general way. So it's useful for it to be progressive.
And what do you envision this money being used for? You actually would put some strings on this.
Yeah. And, a lot of people contrast baby bonds with guaranteed income, or worse, dare I say, universal basic income. I'm not a fan of universal basic income for some of the reasons I just mentioned. I am a fan of guaranteed income. I am a fan of the child tax credit. Simply by being a human being, one needs income. We've seen from some of the experiments that have been done at local levels, the conservative critique that literally giving people money, you will dissuade them from working, you'll discourage them from work. The opposite occurred. By offering people resources, they were able to engage in more work. They were able to overcome all types of circumstances that a state probably couldn't anticipate in order to be more employable. Well, similarly, baby bonds is offering people resources, and you might say, well, why restrict it? Why not let them use it for anything they want to use it for? It is not intended to be paternalistic, but rather it's intended to be specific for the goal of the program. Income and wealth are not the same. Income is necessary and useful, but it is a flow good. It is a periodic reward for some activity. Most Americans get it in the form of labor, but it can come in return for capital as well. Baby bonds is dealing with wealth, which is perhaps a paramount indicator of economic security. It affords you to go to a college, an expensive college. You're not going to finance that out of income. If you're faced with the criminal justice system and you need to hire an attorney, you're not going to be able to finance that out of income. If you want to go into business, you're not going to be able to finance that out of income. Wealth provides agency in one's life in a way that income doesn't. Therefore, baby bonds is not intended to be paternalistic, but rather keenly focused on getting young people in an asset that will passively, and that's the key word, passively rise over their lifetime. Like a home. What is the difference between a homeowner and a renter? Often a down payment. What is the difference between a worker and a business owner? Now, obviously, I'm being somewhat facetious, but you can be a worker with all the ingenious ideas in the world. If you don't have capital to actualize that idea, you're limited. So what baby bonds does is it redresses some of the exploitive and extrapolative, being able to extrapolate from people aspects of a market by shifting power to them, by offering them wealth so that they can, in an authentic way, have agency in their lives.
This is great. Why? I've been talking to legislators across the country about this idea, and it's not just urban legislators that want to do this, and there's some broader appeal. Why do you think this idea is catching on and gaining some momentum around the country?
I mean, this is not about capitalism or socialism. I'm intentionally using the word economic right because the reality is that for markets to work, people need some power to engage in them. If you enter a market with nothing, you have nothing by which to bargain with. You are simply at the whim of markets or the whim of charity. So, I had a good friend that wrote an article about baby bonds, and I loved her title, An Idea a Conservative Should Love. Because if you're authentic about your belief in markets, then you would hope that people are well-resourced so that they can go into that market and again, authentically bargain for and trade in a way that can lift them up.
One of the quirks is a lot of rural areas these days are represented by Republicans, and these places have also lost a lot of capital and economic development over the last decades as well. So that's one of the arguments I kept hearing.
You're right. I mean, capital flows will go into areas that have been depleted of capital. It becomes, I used the word automatic stabilizer earlier, it would be applicable here as well. So if you imagine areas that for various reasons might have divestments or loss of capitals, what baby bonds does in an automatic way is sends resources in those areas, not just to people, but to geographies. So in that sense, it becomes useful. I mean, in fact, we heard in the previous panel some of the discussions about being an American versus living in another society. Again, the idea of a birthright, this should transcend borders. You should imagine that developing countries, if we want to be true to our humanistic spirit, everybody should have some capital set aside from them for when they become an adult and be able to utilize it.
Let's, if you don't mind, talking a little bit more about where you're coming from, growing up in Bed-Stuy. But when we were talking about that for the Bloomberg profile we did of you, you really didn't like that rags to riches story. You didn't want to be seen as your story to be seen as inspirational and an inspirational success story. Why is that? What's behind that?
I mean, we cherry pick. We pick examples of successful cases, and what we don't do with those stories is all the other evidence of systematic evidence of people that did work hard, that did study hard, that were not successful. So those anecdotes are inauthentic. They're not actual. And then also, if you look at my own personal case, I say this in the article, I'd rather have my parents. If I had the choice at 18 of having access to pathways that could lead me to be a professor through that expensive Brooklyn Friends education that they afforded me, or have them, I would have made a different choice. But that choice wasn't afforded to me. So that's a tragic choice that they made. And that's a tragic choice that millions of families are having to make when we ask them to grit, to actually be superhuman. We ask them to be above average. Everybody can't be above average. So, LeBron James in a commercial one time pointed out that, I get this narrative of coming from a humble beginning and making it. And in this Nike commercial, he said, I want to live in a society where there are no more humble beginnings. And that's what I want. I don't want humble beginnings. If we want to have true competition, if we want to have true human rights, then we need to eliminate humble beginnings.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a couple more minutes, but that is a really wonderful place to end, I think. Really appreciate you coming in and sharing your wisdom with us and sharing your thoughts for the Bloomberg story. So
thank you, Ben.
All right, thank you a lot.